Hello, my name is Dr. Hannah Chapman. I am the Karen and Adid Dawisha Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Miami University. Today, we will be listening to a talk by our guest, Sasha de Vogel, who is currently a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Michigan. De Vogel's research examines the politics of authoritarian regimes, collective action, and protest, focusing specifically on the former Soviet Union. So today for our talk, Sasha de Vogel will be speaking on the topic of the limits of repression in Belarus. Belarus is currently experiencing the largest protest in the country's history in response to allegations of widespread electoral fraud in the August 9th presidential election that saw Alexander Lukashenka reelected for his sixth term in office. Today, de Vogel will be giving us an overview of the history of the protest and what it means for the relationship between Belarus and Russia. I would like to specifically thank the Having-Her Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies and the Menard Family Center for Democracy for sponsoring this event. Please enjoy the talk.
So these protests were pretty surprising. Then the protests sort of got even more surprising. Within a week, you had the largest protests in Belarusian history. I estimated that about at least 2.5% of the population were probably protesting on this day, August 16th, 2020. Since then, we're now in the 11th week of protests. They're still proceeding even as recently as this weekend. The regime has been sort of consistently violent. And at the same time, you've seen sort of a whole different culture of protest emerge in the last couple of weeks. It's not just people in the opposition anymore. It's mothers with children, it's elderly people, it's employees at state organizations. So it's really the first kind of wide cross-class democratization kind of protest that we've ever seen in Belarus. So this is a really exciting time, but it's also kind of confusing. It's not really clear sort of why this happened now, where these came from, and also we have questions about how the regime is going to respond to this situation moving forward. So to give you a little roadmap for this talk, I'm going to be giving you some background on Belarus because I know that it's not a place that many people have a lot of knowledge on. I'm going to talk about why these protests are surprising, sort of characteristically in authoritarian regimes. I'm going to give you some thoughts about why these protests are happening now. We're going to look at how the regime has responded, and then we're going to look at how what we should be expecting from Russia moving forward. Okay, so this is Belarus. It's sort of located between Russia on the east, on the eastern border, and the west, the countries of the EU, on its, that's on its western side. Russia is on its eastern side. Belarus, because of where it's located in Europe, has sort of been subject to a variety of different empires over time. Most sort of going into World War I, it was part of the Russian Empire and had been for a bit over 100 years. For a brief period in between 1918 and 1919, it sort of briefly declared independence and the Belarusian People's Republic was formed. That's sort of important now because this has become kind of a touchstone for the opposition in Belarus, as sort of its only experience with independence, a real independent Belarusian state. And it's become sort of this sort of touchstone for democracy, sort of a pro-democratic state. The flag that you see on the top right there, that white and red striped flag, which if you've seen pictures of the protest, you should be familiar with, that's the flag of the Belarusian People's Republic. It's not the flag of modern day Belarus. So from 1922 to 1991, Belarus was part of the Soviet Union. It was one of the first Soviet socialist republics, so it was sort of a founding member of the USSR. And that's that second flag you see there that has the hammer and sickle on it. In 1991, when the USSR dissolved, Belarus became independent as the Republic of Belarus. In 1994, it completed its sort of constitutional revision process and held its first presidential elections. It's a presidential system, much like a lot of the other former Soviet states, which means that the president has a lot of power in these systems. And this makes them particularly vulnerable to sort of authoritarian I don't want to say authoritarian backsliding because they never really reached a democratic standard, but sort of authoritarian regression, let's say. Alexander Lukashenka won the first presidential election. He was a virtual unknown at this time. He had been the head of a collective farm in the Soviet Union And sort of through the transition process, he became known as an opponent of corruption and an opponent of shock therapy, the kind of economic transitions that a lot of the other former Soviet states were going through. So that first picture of him you see is when he was sworn into office in 1994. The bottom one is when he was sworn into office in September in a secret ceremony that was not even announced to the press because it was happening in the midst of these protests. And that final flag you see is the new flag of Belarus that was implemented in 1995 under Lukashenka, which is not a symbol of the protest. It's become a symbol of allegiance to the Lukashenka regime. Another thing that the Lukashenko regime is known for is sort of being unusually repressive for Europe specifically. George Bush called the Lukashenko regime the last dictatorship in Europe in 2005. At that point, he had been in office for 10 years. That was also 15 years ago. Unfortunately, now I think he probably couldn't call him the last dictator in Europe just because of the sort of decline of democracy in the region. But that's still true. He's still recognized to be a sort of strongman leader, excuse me, and very repressive. His regime is also known for having not really fully completed the process of desovietization. So a lot of the economy is still state-owned. And in the security services, for example, there was really not a lot of reform. We didn't see the kind of reform that we saw in other places, even Russia. So the intelligence service in Belarus is still called the KGB. The police is still called the militia, which was the name from the Soviet era because these were like people militias, not the state police. So some background about the economy. As I said, much of the Belarusian economy is state-owned, which means about 40% of the population works for the state. And this is going to become important later when we talk about who's protesting and what kind of leverage the state has over them. The economy is also deeply enmeshed with the Russian economy. About 38% of Belarusian exports go to Russia. About 56% of what they import comes from Russia. Their economy has also basically been dependent on subsidized energy from Russia for the last several decades, although due to kind of a failure to extend this agreement, let's say that's ending by 2024. Belarus is also a member of a variety of kind of regional organizations. Most importantly, the Union State of Russia and Belarus. This is kind of a special organization just for Russia and Belarus. It's a security treaty, an economic treaty, and sort of an agreement that they will have each other's backs. Belarus is also a member of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the Eurasian Economic Union, and it's an observer to the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, or the Shanghai Six. So it's kind of a member of these organizations that are known as kind of autocrats clubs, and especially its aspiration to join the Shanghai Cooperative Organization really speaks to that. They don't want Belarus to join because it's not really in Asia, but that's kind of known to be a sort of a group of autocrats that support each other. So politically, the Lukashenko regime is what we would call highly personalized. So that means that power really resides in the person of Lukashenka. It's not in a ruling elite. So it's not like in a military junta or something like that, or in a group of elites like an oligarchy or something like that. And there's no ruling party. So there's no dominant party in Belarus. An example of a dominant party would be United Russia in Russia. So the legislature in Belarus is dominated by independents who all support Lukashenka. Lukashenka himself is not a member of a political party. There's also very limited opportunities for the opposition to organize. There are very few opposition political parties. I think currently none of them have representation in the parliament. Lukashenka is also rumored to be grooming his teenage son, who is pictured here. I think he's 15 or 16, to be his successor, which is quite frightening to people because Nikolai Lukashenko actually can't even legally run for office for another 20 years. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about why these protests are surprising to us. The kind of protests that are currently happening in Belarus are characteristically surprising to authoritarian regimes. These are large, revolutionary anti-regime protests that happen in very repressive states where we haven't seen a lot of protest activity in the past. So why are they surprising? These protests are surprising because authoritarian regimes characteristically suffer from information problems. And that's because they use repression to control people. Repression means that a lot of the institutions that we see in democracies that gather information from the public and convey it to the state don't serve that function in authoritarian countries. So these are institutions like the free media, like elections, which simply don't operate in these states because to do so would sort of admit views into the public discourse that the authoritarian regime finds threatening. So whereas these institutions act to collect information from the public and share it with the government or share it with the public in democracies, in authoritarian states, they really act to convey information from the government to the public about the authoritarian regime's dominance. Also arising from repression, you have problems with what we call preference falsification. So when individuals feel that they might be punished or they might experience negative consequences for revealing their true beliefs to the public, they simply don't do so. So that means that surveys can't really happen. We're not going to call people on the phone and ask how much they support Lukashenka because they're obviously going to lie. But it also means that within individuals, there's not open sharing about how people really feel about the regime. So maybe I don't support Lukashenka and I have my best friend. I might not tell her because, her whole family works for state-owned enterprises and her brother's in the police force. So I'm going to lie to her, even though we're friends, about what I really think about the regime. So we also, within society, there's kind of this sort of unknown or silent majority sense that people really do support the regime when in reality we don't know. Also in these regimes, protests are quite rare. Anytime a protest occurs in Belarus, to be frank, it's somewhat surprising. Repression works by raising the cost of participating in protests. Also with the regime, like Lukashenka's, you don't really expect that you'll be receiving concessions for protests. They don't really want to sort of negotiate or bargain with people involved in this kind of oppositional activity. So as the incidence of repression rises, the sort of incentives for people to participate in protests really decline. However, once anti-regime protests begin, we can see what we call a revolutionary cascade or an informational cascade. So individuals see that other people actually share their true preferences about the regime. So maybe I go to a protest and I see my friend who I thought supported Lukashenka is also there. Now I've learned about actually, how many people really do support him and that he's a lot more unpopular than I thought he was. Individuals also learn new information about the regime from protests. So in this case, in Belarus right now, they're learning a lot about sort of the extent of repression that the regime is willing to use against them. And this can lead to a kind of snowball effect. So as protests have higher turnout, they sort of escalate and get increasingly higher turnout. Part of why that happens as well is that people feel a little bit safer from repression, ironically. It's very hard to repress groups of, tens or hundreds of thousands of people effectively. So even if a couple of people are experiencing quite extreme repression, most people are actually having a sort of safe experience of protesting. Essentially, the use of repression creates ideal conditions for surprising anti-regime protests. And this is really true in Belarus. Belarus has basically, is so repressive that it's really created optimal conditions to be surprised by an anti-regime protest. So here's just some context about how repressive Belarus is. This is the last 15 years of Freedom House's Nations in Transit score, which is an evaluation that they do about respect for human rights and civil liberties and democracy in the former Soviet and socialist states. So the minimal score you can get on this is a 1. That means that you're a full autocracy. That's a state like North Korea. And as you see, Belarus is the black line there at the bottom, really quite close to a 1, never really getting past 1.5 over the last 20 years. And then just for context, I have Russia, which you see is in blue there. It's been declining since 2005. Now it's converged with Belarus. In green, you have the average for all the Eurasian states, which are all of the former Soviet states except for the Baltics. And then, again, for context, Ukraine there in orange is sort of a more democratic state. So one thing that's really notable here about Belarus is not just how authoritarian it is, but how authoritarian it's been for a long time. Even Russia, which we would tend to consider to be pretty authoritarian at this point, has just been getting steadily worse over that period. Belarus has been holding steady. So looking at some of the individual indicators that go into that score, on the left here we have the score for civil society. Civil society in Belarus, again, is the worst of all four of the indicators that I have here, never rising above a 2 during this period. So the absence of civil society really means that there aren't groups in society that can aggregate grievances and convey them to the government. So we have, again, a lack of information. In the middle, we have elections. Belarus is getting the worst possible score for a good number of years in this period. Again, no information can be gathered there. An interesting thing here is that because there's no dominant party in Belarus, the government can't use elections in which the dominant party is running as sort of an alternative barometer of regime support. So in Russia, when there's an election for the legislature, for example, they can look at how people are supporting United Russia and kind of use that as, kind of an information point for how much they support the Putin regime. In Belarus, you don't have that. And then on the right, we have the media, which again is extremely repressed. There's essentially no free media in Belarus. It's much worse than Russia or the rest of Eurasia. So really what you have here is very, very limited information. You have very few opportunities for people to express themselves. So they're really holding all of that anxiety about the regime in. And you're really creating perfect conditions for the government not to know anything, for people not to know anything about what other people think, and for the international community, likewise, to not really know anything about how supported this regime is. So we're going to take a closer look at the history of protests in Belarus to look at this further. This is from data that I've collected as a part of a larger project on protests in the former Soviet Union. It's from protests that were reported in Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that had over 25 participants. This is data from 2002 to 2019, and I coded any protest over 25 people. So for Belarus, that's 326 protests. This is not complete. It's an undercount of protests, which I can talk about if anyone is interested. So if you look at the first 10 years here, you see a much higher rate of protest than we see in the last 10 years, or the last sort of portion. During that time, Belarus had kind of what you would describe as a sort of a normal protest ecosphere. A range of groups were protesting, labor groups, identity-based groups, students, things like that. They were protesting about a range of issues, using a variety of tactics. And during that period, it kind of looked a lot like what was happening in a country like Azerbaijan, which has a similar population and is a little bit less repressive during that period. But that changed in 2010, 2011. So you see there's a spike and then this kind of U-shaped dip. Actually, 70% of the protests in my data set happened prior to 2011. And what happened there is that there was an election. So there was an election in December 2010. It was a presidential election that was followed by a large protest with up to 40,000 people. We're not exactly sure how many people were there. And that event was brutally repressed. Many people were beaten at the event, so much so that people who were there remember that the square was just sort of covered in blood. Hundreds of people were arrested. All 7 oppositional presidential candidates were arrested. About 25 journalists were arrested, and there are numerous reports of kidnapping, sexual violence, torture, and most of the members of the opposition kind of went into hiding, left the country, went to prison, or house arrested after this. It's also important to note that this coincided with the Arab Spring, so there was a lot of anxiety about autocracy at that time. So what the regime did there is really consistent with its strategy of repression. It's not really trying to co-opt people. It's not trying to persuade them to support it. When it's met with opposition, the Belarusian regime really uses violence to try to prevent them from expressing that. So whereas at this time we see other countries like Russia or China kind of using more persuasive or manipulative techniques to try to get people to either be apathetic or passively support the regime, in Belarus, they're really oriented around silencing dissent. And of course, this crackdown in 2010, 2011 was supported by Russia. In 2011, they passed a new protest law that introduced essentially a whole set of new ways that protests could be illegal. I'm not going to go through them all, but basically the issue with protest permits and these restrictions is that they allow the government to declare any gathering illegal basically on a pretext whenever it feels like it. This had the effect of functionally outlawing all protest. At the bottom of this slide, I have a couple of examples of protests that were repressed. One is this elderly woman who's sort of a celebrated protester. And then on the opposite side, there's another woman holding a single piece of paper. Both of these protests are what we would call a single person picket. In Belarus, you have to actually request a permit to hold up a sign like that. So you have to request a permit to hold up a piece of like printer paper with words written on it. The protest on the right is a pro-LGBTQ rights protest that lasted 3 seconds, it's estimated. All she did was hold up that sign and take a picture of it, and she was fined for doing that. In the middle, this is what was called a toy protest, where to protest the restrictions on protests, people would set up these toys holding signs. They say one of these signs says, "Where's the freedom of the press?" People who organized that were also repressed. So it's a very, very repressive system and very intolerant of protest. So those restrictions, you would say, had the desired effect on turnout. This is a chart of turnout, average turnout at events for the years that my data covers. This is only for the events that we have an estimate of turnout. However, you can see that beginning in 2010, turnout was extremely low. These protests are gathering, maybe 50 to maximum 50 people. This is a chart of the protests that had at least one detention. So you can see that even though the turnout at these protests in the last 10 years is very, very low, like, 25 people maybe, they're still arresting people. Yeah, so the effect of this going into 2020 is that most people in Belarus have never been to a protest, or if they have not been in the last 10 years. They also probably don't feel very connected to the opposition, which are the groups that are organizing these protests now. Okay, so now I'm going to look at, so why are these protests happening now? If Belarusians don't protest, the regime is so repressive, what changed? So one thing that changed is that elections are really sensitive times. Belarus has a 2-round majority runoff system, which means that if Lukashenka doesn't win a majority in the first round, he has to compete in a second round. This is a system that Russia also has. It's not that uncommon in the former Soviet Union. And autocrats generally prefer to avoid the second round runoff as much as possible. These elections are a really important moment for them to demonstrate their dominance of the political sector and demonstrate that they have all of that passive support. This is, again, more important in Belarus because there isn't a dominant party where they can sort of use that as like an alternate barometer of how popular the regime is. However, to generate that huge support, they need to use election fraud because they are probably not that popular, but also even if they are, they can't risk it. So fraud is very widespread in these systems. However, people really don't like election fraud. Even in countries where they know that they don't live in a democracy, where they know the election is a sham, people tend to get very upset when elections are stolen. There's sort of a moral element to it that, like, you've asked me my opinion and now you're just gonna, throw it away. You're just gonna steal this from the people. Even in countries that, don't maybe want to agitate for democracy, people still find value in the vote. So people get very upset about election fraud. Protests can happen there. When that occurs, you get a bunch of new information. So the election fraud conveys new information about how unpopular the regime really is. It allows a moment for people to coordinate about, sharing how they truly feel, and gives them a reason to protest. It becomes kind of a focal point event. And when this happens, you can get very large anti-regime protests, and you can have what we call a color revolution. So what is a color revolution? A color revolution is not, strictly speaking, a revolution. It's really a type of protest. It's become a lot more popular, much more common in the last 20 years. And it's particularly concerning to autocrats, particularly concerning to autocrats in the former Soviet Union, because it's it's been happening regularly there. So color revolution, this is a massive, peaceful anti-regime or revolutionary protest that follows a contested election, where they're demanding that the autocrat leave office. Looking at this little sidebar, this is just a list of some of the best known color revolutions. As you can see, in the early 2000s, they were happening a lot in the Balkan area, in the former Yugoslavia. We then had the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. Kyrgyzstan has had numerous instances of this. It happened in Armenia a couple years ago. Belarus actually had a failed color revolution in 2006, as did Russia in 2011. And then sometimes we talk about the events in Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014 as a color revolution, although that wasn't organized around an election. So these are really scary to leaders in the former Soviet Union. When they leave office, it's not like in a democracy where they can just go, get a consulting job or something like that. These people are going to jail, their assets are being stolen, they are possibly losing their lives. These are also politicians who lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is often something we talk about with Putin. He was in Germany when the Soviet Union fell, and sometimes people like to analyze Putin and sort of see this as a really traumatic event for him. Color revolutions, when they first started happening, were understood by activists in these countries as well as by the international community as an exportable strategy for democratization. And what this meant was that there were all of these instances in which activists started traveling around to share what they were doing with people in other countries. And the US State Department, as well as private actors like George Soros, financed these efforts. The reason that this is even possible is because these are protests about elections, which are predictable. So it becomes possible for activists to anticipate the election, anticipate election fraud, and then sort of try to put these strategies into place. Things like election monitoring, the use of peaceful protests, occupying a square, and things like that. The fact that the US State Department and private actors were financing these sort of skill shares, if you can call it that, has done a lot of damage to, I would say, US-Russia relations, and also to how autocrats see these popular movements. So many autocrats, especially Putin, now see popular revolutions like what's happening in Belarus right now as foreign funded, as external attempts at regime change. It's extremely common to hear them talk about protests in this way, and to sort of take out some of the frustration about these protests on the US. This is part of why Putin hates Hillary Clinton so much. And to really try to viciously repress these popular revolutions. Now, although I also want to point out that although most of these color revolutions happened in the early 2000s, and they have not been as successful lately, this is still occupies a lot of space in autocrats' brains, especially Putin's. Okay, so another reason why these protests are happening now is that there are changing conditions in Belarus since the last presidential election in 2015, which really didn't see a great response from the opposition. So authoritarian regimes still need to be responsive, even if they aren't representative. And the Lukashenka regime, as I have pointed out already, is extremely reliant on repression. It hasn't really evolved any of these more sort of contemporary strategies that we see autocrats in Russia and China using to cultivate either support or apathy among the electorate. They remain highly dependent on repression. They're also not very experimental, which Russia and China both are, to try to come up with new strategies to get people sort of on board. In the last 2 years, there have been a lot of discussions between Russia and Belarus about creating a formally unified state. This is a step up from the current agreement that Russia and Belarus have. It was actually the idea that they were going to create a single country together. And this really upset a lot of people in Belarus. They really resented the fact that a non-democratically elected leader was going to basically give their country to Putin, even if they're kind of friendly towards Russia. They're not anti-Russia, they're not anti-Putin, but this was sort of a bridge too far. And it actually produced a lot of protests in 2019. It was some of the most active, that was until 2020, probably the most active year in Belarusian protests we'd seen in like 10 years. The coronavirus crisis was handled incredibly badly by the Lukashenka regime. They basically denied that it was real, denied that it could affect Belarusians, really didn't provide medical care for people. Clearly, this is a problem in general, but in the post-Soviet world, people put a lot of stock in performance legitimacy. So how well is the government giving us services and things like that, as sort of a holdover from expectations of how the state treats you from the Soviet era. So the Lukashenko regime was basically an abject failure in this department. There's been a lot of economic growth recently, so the middle class is much larger. And as we know, the middle class tends to be more likely to demand representation. They're also more likely to have traveled abroad, experienced Western democracy. They're more likely to be able to think critically. They're better educated, so they can think critically about the government and what it's doing. So these people haven't really been incorporated into the regime in any meaningful way. And then finally, we have the emergence of the internet and new technologies in Belarus. Belarus has a burgeoning tech sector. About half of its economic growth is driven by the tech sector. So we have more educated young people, especially staying in Belarus to work in the tech sector rather than leaving and sort of having that brain drain effect, which can be stabilizing for authoritarian states. They have a lot of partnerships with foreign tech companies as well. A lot of the population now has access to the internet. About 80% of people now have access to the internet versus just 32% 10 years ago. So this means that they have the ability to share information, to coordinate in a way that the state is really not able at this time to fully censor or control. So you have a combination here of a local population that has changing expectations for the political system. It has the ability to do things like make apps to allow that coordination to happen, and you have a state that can't really respond to that. And this is actually something that we saw in Russia in 2011, 2012, before there were big anti-regime protests there as well. And then finally, the regime really misused repression in the lead up to this election. It knew that this election was going to be different. It knew that it kind of had a more difficult situation on its hands. And instead of using, again, those sort of more I'm going to say elegant or manipulative tactics to finesse the situation, it relied on repression. And this repression really allowed this protest movement to emerge in the first place. So there were 3 opposition political candidates running for president. And by July, these people had all been essentially removed from the race. They've been arrested or forced to flee the country. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's in the middle of this picture here, she was the wife of an arrested candidate. The other 2 women, Veronika Sapalika and Maria Kolesnikova, they were the campaign managers of the other 2 candidates. So these 3 women decided that they were going to come together, sort of unite their campaigns behind Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who had not previously been involved in politics at all. And she became the consensus protest vote for all 3 of these opposition groups. So this is really important because usually the opposition in these states have a really hard time working with each other. They tend to be very factional. They don't coordinate very well. So the fact that the removal of these candidates allowed them, the opposition, to channel itself into one candidate is what really allowed Svetlana Tikhanovskaya to potentially win this election. If these candidates had not been removed from the ballot, it's extremely unlikely that we would be seeing the situation that we currently have in Belarus. Tikhanovskaya was also holding very large gatherings even before the election. She only had about 2 weeks to campaign, but she was speaking to crowds of like 100,000, 60,000 people already as an unknown previously. So this campaign was very effective in response to that repression. They also didn't allow international election monitors to monitor this election. Election monitors, like from the OSCE, have to be invited by the government to monitor elections. And Lukashenka did this, but he just did it so late that the OSCE could not really attend. But Russia did send election monitors, and they said that it was a fully legitimate election. One of the effects of this is that grassroots election monitoring became really important. Members of that tech sector put together apps where people could crowdsource from across the country fraud that they were seeing or election results in their local precincts, which is how they actually knew on the day of the election that fraud had occurred and how extensive it was. So how did the regime respond to this? They responded, unsurprisingly, with a tried and true tactic of, frankly, extraordinary repression. The level of repression that they used immediately shocked people in Belarus and around the world. So we've seen things like detentions, beatings, torture, sexual violence, kidnapping, in addition to kind of like regular coercive stuff at protests like pepper spraying and water cannon type stuff. They're currently discussing whether they want to use live ammunition against protesters, so just murdering them. We've also seen targeted repression. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya left the country virtually immediately after the election. Maria Kolesnikova was kidnapped and is currently in detention. Many of the lawyers who are representing the protesters have been arrested or harassed. The regime has used some censorship, so they're trying to disrupt the use of the internet in sort of this really brute force way by just turning it off. They've persecuted the press. They expelled all foreign journalists recently. And they've also organized a couple of counter demonstrations, so we know that people do still support Lukashenka. However, the efficacy of this strategy has really been mixed. When you use this kind of extreme violence against regular people, as opposed to, grizzled opposition activists, it really is upsetting to people. So as the state used this violence, especially against women who constituted a very large share of these protests, people who may have been neutral or weak supporters of the regime or really not interested in protesting became deeply upset and joined the ranks of the protesters. The use of this violence is probably responsible for why they sort of so rapidly escalated to the largest day of protest in history. We also saw a lot of state employees and pensioners getting mobilized because of this violence against the state. And this is important. State employees are really in a position where the state can easily distribute benefits to them to get them to support the regime. It can force them to vote for the regime as making it sort of part of their job. The head of the factory can say, like, it's election day, like, get in this bus, we're going voting. And they're also in a great position to be repressed. They can easily lose their job. They're really dependent on the state for their livelihood. So the fact that these people, again, a huge share of the Belarusian population, 40% of the population, that some of these state employees are turning against the regime is a big deal. Similarly, pensioners sort of hold a special revered place in the sort of post-Soviet mind. So to see these people out there, the elderly, getting violently arrested by the riot police is a pretty big deal. When you use very serious repression, you risk defection by the security services. We haven't really seen this yet, but it will be an issue if they do start trying to use live ammunition on the protesters. Belarus is not a large place. Minsk is not a huge city. The people who are executing this repression live in the communities that they are repressing. There's a reason why these people are wearing masks in all of the pictures that you see of them. And actually, they've had some success in getting the riot police and the various enforcers to leave them alone by trying to rip their masks off so they can see their faces and they kind of go running. So we could see defection becoming an issue, and that would be a very serious problem for the Lukashenko regime. If he loses the support of the security services, he really has absolutely no way to retain office. There have been increased sanctions by the US and the EU, which can have economic consequences. The sanctions are against people who have been in charge of executing this violence, not against the country as a whole. Neither recognize Lukashenka as the president of Belarus at this time. I should say also this picture is Lukashenka flying around in his luxury helicopter, looking down on the protests from above. And then last, negotiations become really difficult once you've used this kind of violence. So because the opposition is sort of weak and a lot of people have been repressed or have left the country and things like this, it's very hard to think who the regime would actually negotiate with if they wanted to enter into negotiations. From the opposition's perspective, they've used such violence that it's sort of impossible to imagine at this point that there's a sort of a resolution that would be acceptable to both sides, given the crimes that have been committed. Okay, so what is the role of Russia in this conflict? Throughout this sort of episode of protest, it's been said very, very often that what Putin decides to do will kind of determine the outcome of these protests. It's a little bit unfair to Belarus, and it also assumes a lot about what Putin wants and why he would do certain things. It is true that Belarus and Russia have a special relationship. They have this sort of ethnic Slavic bond. Eastern Orthodox is the majority religion in both countries. They have all these sort of treaties and organizations that they're a part of together. And Lukashenka and Putin they're not friends, but they're sort of the same generation. They're virtually the same age, significantly younger than the other autocrats in the region. They have this kind of special bond. Here they are playing an exhibition hockey match together. However, so far it seems like Putin really wants Lukashenko to solve this problem himself. They've had several meetings over the last couple of months as these protests have continued. But so far, Russia has mainly just been meeting its obligations to Belarus, as determined by some of those treaties and organizations. And it's given a lot of financial support. So they recently gave Belarus $1.5 billion. So it seems the strategy here is that Putin wants to provide Lukashenka the tools to solve this himself versus directly intervening. However, Russia, I'm sure, will also, if he needs sort of a backstop to retain control, Russia can potentially provide that. It's also worth noting that right now Russia, as of today, not necessarily in August or September, right now Russia has a lot of other problems. The conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan is something that it's trying to resolve. Coronavirus crisis obviously is ongoing. Kyrgyzstan just had a revolution. The US election is something that it's very concerned with. So it has a lot of other stuff on its plate, and Belarus is not necessarily at the top of that list right now. It's also not very clear that Russian intervention would be all that helpful. Putin is not the source of Lukashenka's power. Lukashenka was in power for 6 years before Putin entered the presidency. Military intervention might be helpful, but right now it's not maybe so necessary. And the Lukashenka regime is very able to use coercion, so they're not really having problems with the security forces right now, and the protesters haven't sort of escalated to armed conflict themselves. Also, the protesters become more anti-Russia the more Putin supports Lukashenka. So previously, in general, these protests are not against Russia. They're really for self-determination of Belarusians. The more that Putin intervenes, the more he risks kind of like radicalizing them and turning these into protests. Radicalizing is not maybe the right word, but sort of turning these into protests against Russia for, Western democracy. It's also not obvious that Putin needs Lukashenka to be president specifically. Lukashenka has been a really fickle ally, and increasingly, especially as the sort of natural gas subsidies have been begun to be phased out, he's really willing to play Russia and the EU off of each other. So he recently secured a deal with Norway to buy their natural gas, which was very upsetting to Putin. Things like this. I'll cover that later. There are a lot of Belarusians that live in Russia. A lot of Russians see Belarusians as sort of, brothers or sort of people just like them. So if Putin were to support a very violent crackdown there, it could have an impact on domestic opinion. And then I also want to say this is not an analogous situation to what happened in Ukraine in 2014. So there's not an issue. We aren't going to have a Crimea type situation here, basically. Belarus does not hold the same place in the cultural imagination of Russia that Crimea did. Putin doesn't really have a reason to want to annex Belarus, especially because Lukashenko not that long ago seemed willing to just give it to him. Also, annexing Crimea was tremendously expensive financially and also politically costly globally for Putin. So I think it's pretty unlikely that we're going to see something like that happen here. Russia's priorities in this case, I think, are maintaining its sphere of influence on its border states. It really wants these, the states on its periphery to serve as a buffer from NATO, essentially. This is kind of Cold War thinking about sort of what's ours and what's yours. And that's part of why it's afraid that these states will democratize, especially via color revolution, which it sees as these sort of externally funded revolutions to become part of the West. So that's like a worst case scenario. Putin definitely doesn't want Belarus to become a democracy. Russia is also very invested in supporting autocracy in general. This is another reason why it really doesn't want Belarus to become a democracy. We have all become increasingly aware over the last several years of Russia's various activities abroad to support the legitimacy of autocracy and undermine democracy. And that's partially, again, sort of a response to this perceived prevalence of foreign intervention in domestic politics in autocracies via color revolutions. So by the West funding popular revolutions in autocracies. Okay, so now I'm just going to cover 3 scenarios for what I think could happen next. So the first, the sort of open conflict scenario. If protests escalate into a sort of intractable violent conflict, the West would probably become more active in supporting a democratic transition. In this case, I could see Russia intervening sort of militarily to support Lukashenka. However, I think this is very unlikely because the protests don't seem to be moving in that direction. Second scenario, a dacha outside of Moscow for Lukashenka. So if the protests are sustained but are not powerful enough to actually overthrow the regime, there can still be really negative long-term consequences, especially because of the use of violence. If the protests continue, the economic toll could be quite high, also related to sanctions. All these things could make Lukashenko to be sort of a useless partner for Russia. They might prefer to have somebody else more stable who they can really work with in power. So in this case, I would see Russia assisting in some kind of a negotiated handoff, sort of negotiating Lukashenko out of office. But this would not be democratization. It would be sort of an authoritarian to authoritarian transition. However, it may appear to be a victory for the protesters. It may take the form of some kind of a concession to protesters, but it would not be democratization. I think this is also, because Russia is quite busy right now, I would say that in the short term, this is unlikely. It's also quite a risky strategy, but we could see it in the long term. And the third one, which I think is the most likely, is that these protests are going to slowly decline. People get tired of protesting. Winter is coming. There's no upcoming election to organize around, and the repression is quite severe. Also, Belarusians are not culturally used to protesting in the way that some other places are kind of more invested in creating long-term movements. They're just sort of more inexperienced, let's say. So in this case, Lukashenko can retain power, but he faces a transformed opposition in a population that's much more likely to remobilize against him later. So here I would see Russia providing strategic guidance to kind of help Lukashenko develop these more manipulative tools that the regime hasn't really mastered yet. So that might look like liberalizing reforms, like increasing the openness of civil society, allowing for more political parties to exist, so that you can co-opt them, and sort of channel people into kind of electoral contests that you can control rather than street protest. We would also see repression continuing. And in this case, the parliamentary elections in a couple of years and the next presidential election will probably be the sort of most sensitive moments where we could see revolution happening. And again, I think this is probably the most likely scenario. So that's all that I have to say. Sorry, I think I went over a couple of minutes, but I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.